Imagine for a second that you are the most famous person on the planet, an icon whose voice made stadiums vibrate from London to Rio. But right now, your world has shrunk to the size of a single darkened room in Kensington that resembles a medical bunker more than a rock star's bedroom. The calendar reads November 22nd, 1991. The clock shows 6 in the evening, and behind the high brick walls of the Garden Lodge mansion, a scene worthy of a horror movie is unfolding. A pack of hungry wolves in human form, the paparazzi, is literally hanging on the fences, bribing the staff, and keeping watch in shifts, waiting for only one thing: the shot of your corpse being carried out. Freddie Mercury, a man who spent his entire life controlling every aspect of his show, is trapped. But it is in this exact moment, when his body is destroyed and his eyes can barely see the light, that he makes a decision that seems like absolute madness. He had been silent for years. He had furiously denied the obvious. He had lied to the faces of his close friends and even his bandmates, claiming he was just tired, even though the purple spots of Kaposi's sarcoma could no longer be hidden by any makeup. But exactly 24 hours before his last breath, when the countdown had shifted from days to minutes, he decides to break this vow of silence. Why? You probably think this was an act of Christian humility or an attempt to clear his conscience before meeting eternity, but you are deeply mistaken, because Freddie was not seeking forgiveness. He was preparing a final, brutal, preemptive strike. To understand the true meaning of this act, you need to look away from the official biographies and look at one tiny, terrifying detail that most overlook: the bedside table where rows of pill bottles stood. 2 weeks prior to this day, something happened there that completely changes the picture of what was occurring. Something that turns his deathbed confession from an act of desperation into the cold, calculated move of a grandmaster who knows the game is lost, but refuses to give the opponent his king. Freddie understood one terrible thing as soon as his heart stopped. Those people behind the fence, the tabloids that had hounded him for years, calling him plague-ridden, and placing bets on the date of his death, would instantly rewrite his history. They would turn him into a victim, into a cautionary tale, into a dirty joke, and he, the great pretender, could not allow his finale to be directed by someone else. Ask yourself honestly, could you, while in agony, think not about the salvation of your soul, but about a PR strategy capable of shutting the mouths of millions of haters? Most of us, in such a situation, would beg for peace. But Freddie, looking death in the face, saw in it not an end, but a final opportunity for a show, and he decided to use the only weapon he had left, the truth, but a truth delivered with such precision that it would explode like a bomb at the exact second when he became unreachable for criticism. But before we learn exactly what he said, you must understand that the decision to release this statement was not made on November 22nd. It was predestined by the very moment his hand swept the life-saving medicines off the table, leaving only painkillers, and that gesture became the very dagger that severed the final thread connecting him to life. Let's be brutally honest and rip the gold sequins off this image. By November 1991, Freddie Mercury, that same titan who, in a white tank top and jeans, controlled a crowd of 100,000 with a single movement of his pinky finger, had ceased to exist, giving way to a ghost locked inside his own body. His physical condition was not just bad, it was catastrophic, and if you had looked into that room, you would have seen a man who was almost completely blind, whose leg was disfigured by terrible ulcers, and who could not even prop himself up on the pillows without excruciating pain. But the most terrifying thing was happening not inside the house, but outside. The tabloids, those vultures with printing presses, were not just speculating on his health. They had organized a betting pool on his life, releasing newspapers with screaming headlines, "Official, is he dying?" and publishing blurry photos of his emaciated figure taken with long focus lenses through cracks in the fence. Freddie knew about this. He felt this pressure on his skin, and here arises the question that should torment you. Why did he, a man with a fortune of millions of pounds, having the best lawyers, allow this circus to continue, giving no comments until the very last second? You might think he was simply afraid, that he was ashamed of his diagnosis, because in 1991, the word AIDS was not just a medical term, but a social sentence, a brand that turned national darlings into outcasts whom people were afraid to touch. But the truth is that Freddie did not fear judgment. He feared losing control over the final act of his play, and he understood one cruel truth. If he died in silence, the press would write an obituary not about a great musician, but about a victim of a debauched lifestyle, turning his legacy into a dirty, moralizing fable. And so, when the tension reached its peak, he summoned his manager, Jim Beach, a man who could keep secrets better than a Swiss bank, and this summons became the beginning of the end. Imagine this scene. The room smells of medicine and expensive lilies. The air is heavy and stale. Freddie lies with his eyes closed, gathering the remains of his strength to speak the words that were to become his epitaph. Ask yourself honestly, could you in such a state think about the wording of a press release? Most people in agony think about pain, about fear, about the darkness that is approaching. But Freddie Mercury, in that moment, was not a patient, but a director giving final instructions before the curtain falls. You probably think he wanted to release this statement, to receive a wave of love and support, to have fans pray for him, to feel less alone in the face of eternity. This is a beautiful thought, but it is absolutely wrong, because Freddie did not need pity. He needed permission to leave. Remember those pills he refused 2 weeks ago, leaving only powerful painkillers? That was not capitulation, that was setting the stage, and now all that remained was for him to turn on the spotlights. He dictated the words to Jim Beach. I wish to confirm that I have been tested HIV positive and have AIDS. And in that moment, he was not seeking salvation. He was signing his own death warrant, but on his own terms. It was a paradox that is hard to wrap one's head around. A statement about illness, usually made to explain one's condition and ask for privacy for treatment, was in this case used as a tool to end the fight. He knew that as soon as these words left the walls of Garden Lodge, as soon as the world learned the truth, he would no longer need to pretend, no longer need to keep up appearances, no longer need to live for the sake of keeping a secret. This statement was not a cry for help. It was the key that unlocked the door to oblivion, and Freddie, clutching his manager's hand, knew that as soon as the text was sent to the news agencies, there would be no turning back, neither for him nor for the world he was about to leave in a state of absolute shock. On November 23, 1991, at exactly 8:00 p.m., as a cold London fog enveloped Kensington, Jim Beach gave the signal, and the text of Freddie Mercury's official statement went out to the wires of international news agencies, causing an effect comparable only to a bomb exploding in the center of Trafalgar Square. The world, which for years had fed on rumors, gossip, and blurry photographs, suddenly received a 220-volt shock. Phones in the Queen office glowed white-hot in mere seconds. News studios interrupted broadcasts with breaking news. Fans wept right on the streets, and conservative critics, who just yesterday were dragging his name through the mud, choked on their own bile, not knowing how to react to such disarming honesty. The noise was deafening, planetary, hysterical. It seemed that the very atmosphere was vibrating with millions of voices discussing, condemning, and mourning a man who had not even died yet. You probably imagine that at this moment panic reigned in the Garden Lodge mansion, that Freddie, bedridden, was greedily listening to the news, awaiting the crowd's verdict, or that his loved ones were running around trying to shield him from the reaction of the outside world. But reality was so far from this picture that it makes one's blood run cold. Inside the walls of Garden Lodge, in that very room where the air smelled of medicine and wilting flowers, an absolute ringing, unnatural silence fell, the kind you can only hear in deep space or the second before someone's heart stops. This was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, formed after the very reason for existence was pumped out of a person. Freddie did not listen to the news. He didn't even open his eyes. And at that moment, something happened that doctors call a psychosomatic phenomenon, and mystics call the snapping of the silver cord. As soon as the truth left his lips, as soon as the secret he had guarded, like Cerberus, became public property, the tension that had kept his body alive for the last few months simply vanished. You think the disease was killing him slowly? No. That evening it seemed as if someone simply flipped a switch. Ask yourself, what keeps a person in this world when the body has already failed? Fear, responsibility, a secret. Freddie Mercury lived for control. He held on to life with his teeth only because he was afraid that if he left prematurely, his secret would be revealed by someone else, by someone who had no right to touch it. But now that the statement was published, when he himself, by his own will, put an end to the speculation, his mission was accomplished. He lay on silk pillows, his breathing becoming increasingly shallow, and those few who were in the room, Jim Hutton, Peter Freestone, realized with horror that they were witnessing not a fight for life, but a conscious, calm refusal of it. It was the most shocking twist, a statement about illness, which is usually made with the hope of understanding and support in the fight. For Freddie became a signal for surrender, permission to himself to unclench the fingers with which he was clinging to the edge of the abyss. The viewer waits for drama, tears, final instructions, but Freddie sank into a state resembling a trance, where external sounds, the wailing of sirens, phone calls, the shouts of the crowd behind the fence, ceased to exist, giving way to the internal rhythm of fading. He didn't want to know what the world was saying. He didn't give a damn if they called him a hero or a sinner, because in that second, he had performed his final, grandest escape. He had escaped from the prison of public opinion to the only place where the paparazzi couldn't reach him. The silence in the room grew thicker, broken only by rasping, wet breathing, and everyone standing nearby felt it in their skin. The king is not just dying. He is leaving because he decided so himself, and no force on earth, no fan love, and no medicine could hold him back anymore, for the main chain, the chain of silence, had finally been broken. Exactly 24 hours after the world shuddered at the confession, on Sunday, November 24th, the story, it would seem, should have only just begun, because the doctors on duty at the king's bedside assured everyone his heart, despite his destroyed body, remained frighteningly strong. The medics predicted several more days, perhaps even weeks of agonizing struggle, and herein lies the very paradox that haunts biographers. How did a man whose thirst for life was legendary fade away so rapidly, as if someone simply pulled the plug from the socket? You think the disease suddenly accelerated, but the truth is much scarier and at the same time more majestic, because that same dagger we spoke of at the beginning enters the equation, a small, unnoticed detail that overturned the course of history. Remember what was happening behind the closed doors of Garden Lodge 2 weeks prior to this day. Freddie, looking into the eyes of his doctor, makes a decision that would make any normal person's blood run cold. He refuses all life-sustaining medications. He cancels AZT, the only drug that kept the virus in check, leaving only painkillers so as not to scream in pain when his nerve endings flared with fire. Why did he do this? It would seem like a gesture of despair, the capitulation of a broken man, but do not rush to conclusions, because Freddie Mercury never surrendered without a plan. Here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in. You think he just wanted to end the suffering, but in reality, he synchronized his watch with world time. He understood that if he made the statement about the illness and remained alive for another month, the press would turn him into a pitiful spectacle, into a dying swan whom housewives would pity and talk shows would discuss, savoring the details of his degradation. He could not allow pity to replace admiration. Refusing the pills was not suicide, but the cold calculation of a genius director who knows exactly when the curtain must fall so that the applause does not turn into awkward coughing in the hall. Imagine this scene. Outside the window, the November wind rages along with the hysteria of fans who have just learned the truth and are bringing flowers to the walls of the mansion, hoping for a miracle. While inside, in the twilight of the bedroom, Freddie already knew that the miracle was canceled. He lay on silk sheets, almost blind, emaciated to the state of a skeleton, but his mind in the final hours worked with the precision of a Swiss mechanism. As soon as the statement went on air, as soon as the world swallowed the bait, Freddie let go of that invisible cable that held him in this world. Ask yourself, is it a coincidence that death came exactly a day after the confession? The probability of such a coincidence is vanishingly small. It was the final chord of his directed life, his last trick, which forced reality to bend to his will. He calculated everything to the minute, admit the truth, seize control of the headlines from the tabloids, depriving them of the exclusive, and die on his own terms while the news was still shocking, giving no one time for analysis, judgment, or hypocritical prayers. At the moment his breathing stopped, the world experienced a double blow. People hadn't even had time to digest the news that he was sick when they were immediately stunned by the news of his death. It was an emotional knockout. Freddie didn't just die, he staged an escape from the cage of public opinion, leaving us with our mouths open and the feeling that we had been outplayed. He turned his death into art, forcing people to talk about AIDS not as the dirty secret of the marginalized, but as a tragedy of antique scale that took the king at the peak of the discussion, and therein lay his final, bitterest victory. The music cuts off mid-note, the screen goes black, and in this ringing silence that follows the final chord, you feel not just sadness, but a strange, sticky anxiety, because Freddie Mercury's story does not end with his last breath. It mutates into the most brutal argument in the history of rock and roll. You are probably sitting now thinking that before you is a flawless portrait of a martyr, a saint in a yellow jacket who ascended to the heavens, but let's rip off this glossy band-aid and look at the wound underneath. As soon as the king's body grew cold, the world split into two irreconcilable camps, and which one you join will say more about you than you think. On one side, you hear the voices of activists from the 90s who were not crying, but screaming with rage, accusing Mercury of cowardice and betrayal. Ask yourself an uncomfortable question. If the most famous singer on the planet had confessed not a day before his death, but 3 years before it, how many lives could that have saved? Imagine this alternative scenario. Freddie comes out to the press in 1987, full of strength, and says, "I am fighting." How many millions of dollars for research would have appeared instantly? How many stigmas would have been destroyed? You want to believe that he did everything right, but this thought, "what if?" starts to corrode your confidence like acid. You begin to see in his silence not pride, but the fear of losing the crown, the fear that the public would turn away from the plague-ridden idol, and at that moment the hero starts to seem like an egoist. But just as you are ready to pass a guilty verdict, the plot does a dead loop, flipping all your arguments upside down. Look at this from the other side of the barricades. What if his silence was not an act of fear, but an act of supreme self-sacrifice for the sake of music? If he had confessed earlier, every concert, every interview, every review would have boiled down to one word: AIDS. Journalists would have looked for spots on his skin, not notes in his voice. He would have ceased to be a musician and become a walking medical exhibit. He understood that as soon as the label was stuck on, the magic would disappear, and so he remained silent, gritting his teeth so that you, the audience, could listen to innuendo, and the show must go on as art and not as a suicide note. And right here, your brain should explode from the contradiction. He sacrificed the opportunity to become a political leader in order to remain an artist until the very last second. And this realization hits you in the gut harder than any criticism. You thought you understood his motives, but in reality, you have only just touched the bottom of this tragedy. The confession. 24 hours prior, it isn't just timing, it is a scalpel with which he severed his private life from his legacy. But the price of this decision is thousands of people who perhaps died because the world remained silent about the disease for too long. Now that you know about the pills, about the calculation, about this hellish choice between the role of a savior and the role of a creator, I want you to stop being just a spectator. Go down to the comments, but don't write the banal legend. That is too simple for such a complex story. I challenge you. Whose side are you on in this moral war? Was Freddie's action, the confession a day before the end, the greatest act of defending his art, a genius move that allowed him to leave undefeated? Or was it the final selfish gesture of a star who preferred the comfort of silence to responsibility before millions of the dying? This is not a rhetorical question. This is a test of your value system. A hero who protected music, or a coward who hid the truth? Write your verdict right now, because I will be reading every answer and arguing with you until I'm hoarse.